Welcome to this introductory course on Coordinated Needs Assessment. In this module we will cover the following elements: key concepts of Coordinated Needs Assessment, linking assessment to decision making, the Needs Assessment Framework, the Good Enough Principle, the assessment cycle, and basic principles for successful humanitarian assessments. We will first review the concept of needs and needs assessment. We'll also explore different types of assessment from a coordination point of view, explain why it's important to coordinate assessment, the recommended coordination structure, and the pros and cons of various modalities of coordination. Let's first define need. The concept of need is often misused, and it's important to agree on its meaning before going further in this course. In this graph, the need is the difference between the preferred state following humanitarian relief, recovery, or defined development goals, and the actual observed or measured state that the affected population is currently in. Fundamentally, you can identify a need where there's evidence or report of a lack, a deficit, a deficiency, a problem, an issue, a gap, a shortage, etc. It's important to mention this because people often confuse need, the absence of something, with need, the provision of something. For example, in the sentence, IDPs are thirsty and have much less water available than before they were displaced, the gap is clearly expressed and we can see a real need. In contrast, in this sentence, IDPs need psychosocial support and access to protected water sources and attend weekly hygiene session. Need is being defined by a potential response. No shortage or gap has been expressed. We must always distinguish between need as a problem and need as a response. In this course, we will define needs assessment using the definition from the Humanitarian Needs Assessment, the Good Enough Guide. Needs assessment is how organizations identify and measure the humanitarian needs of disaster-affected community. Simply put, needs assessment is the best way to answer the question, what assistance do disaster-affected communities need? A coordinated assessment is an assessment planned and carried out by humanitarian actors in partnership in order to document the impact of a particular crisis and identify the needs of affected populations. The results of the assessments are shared with the broader humanitarian community. The term coordinated assessment includes both joint and harmonized assessments. This definition is taken from the Operational Guidance for Coordinated Assessment in Humanitarian Crisis, published by the Interagency Standing Committee in 2012. This graph shows the three types of coordination of assessments between organizations. Please drag and drop the titles and characteristics to the correct places in the table. Uncoordinated assessments are the reason why guidance on coordinated assessment was developed. In uncoordinated assessments, datasets are not interoperable, and it becomes very difficult to use the results for overall analysis. Analysis based on uncoordinated assessment is a very time-consuming affair and inefficient if datasets cannot easily be compared. Consequently, it becomes almost impossible to provide an overview of needs in a timely fashion. In harmonized assessments, data collection, processing, and analysis is undertaken separately. However, the data is sufficiently comparable, for example due to the use of common operational datasets or key indicators, to be compiled into a single database and to be subject to shared analysis. Finally, in the case of a joint assessment, data collection, processing, and analysis form one single and common process among agencies. This leads to a common report and is sometimes also referred to as a common assessment. Such assessments range from inter- and inter-cluster sector joint assessments, for example after Typhoon Yolanda in the Philippines in 2013, to intra-cluster assessments like the Education Joint Needs Assessment in the Central African Republic in 2013, and a lot of others. So why should we coordinate assessments? Coordinated assessments leads to better coverage, better analysis, better articulation of the needs of people affected by emergencies. We will agree on prioritization of needs to ensure that the most vulnerable receive appropriate and timely assistance. It creates a common operational picture from which to carry out strategic planning and develop a coordinated response. It makes linkages between assessments and monitoring. Ultimately, it answers the questions: are we responding to the needs of the population, and how do needs change over time? Here is the standard architecture for a cluster system in a given country. Cluster coordination happens at the inter-cluster coordination level, and leadership is provided by the humanitarian coordinator or the resident coordinator. The coordination structure for assessments will take advantage of existing coordination mechanisms as seen in multiple crises since 2010, for example in Pakistan, Syria, Bangladesh, Haiti, Philippines, etc. A formal coordination structure is created to coordinate or facilitate the assessment. It generally takes the name of an assessment working group. The assessment working group liaises with each cluster through dedicated focal points, usually the information management officers. The assessment working group reports to the inter-cluster coordination mechanism, which reports to the humanitarian coordinator or the resident coordinator. The same principles apply if several organizations want to do a joint assessment in a country where no official coordination structure exists. That is, where neither OCHA nor a humanitarian country team is present. This time the assessment team will liaise and work directly with focal points in each of the participating organizations. Not all situations require a coordinated assessment. The decision for what kind of assessment depends on many factors, including the geographical scope and scale of the disaster, the agencies already working in the area, whether the event has happened before and what is known about previous impacts, whether it is already known that one key sector is likely to be more critically affected, how easy it is to identify the worst affected geographical areas, for example by government information or satellite imagery, what pre-crisis and in-crisis secondary information is already available, whether stakeholders have already started their own assessments, security and access constraints, how long people have been affected by the disaster. Was it sudden onset disaster? Have organizations been quick to begin planning? Or did the disaster build up over time and took a while to get attention? All of these factors will help determine how best to approach an assessment, remembering that the overall aim is a shared operational understanding. So, let's have a look at the pros and cons of coordinated assessments. Joint assessments are recommended at the beginning of a sudden onset disaster, when time pressure and logistical constraints require strong coordination and resource sharing between partners in order to develop a common understanding of the situation and an agreed response plan. Later on, harmonized assessments are usually more appropriate because more time is available to determine data standards, and the risks of delay do not heavily impact the result of the assessment in terms of initial response planning and fund mobilization. Sectors clusters can then begin the kinds of assessment that require more sector-specific detail, the use of specialists, and possibly have more representative sampling strategies. Organizations can begin detailed multi-sectoral assessments in their own project areas and even look at beneficiary selection and targeting criteria. Here is a more complete table describing criteria used when deciding to perform a joint assessment or not. Click on Continue when you are done reading them. And remember, one size does not fit all in terms of assessments. These are two examples of joint and harmonized assessments. The assessment conducted by several organizations in Bangladesh during the floods of September 2014 is an example of a joint needs assessment, involving the use of common tools and methodologies for data collection and producing results within 1 week of the decision to do the assessment. The assessment conducted in Niger in 2012 is a good example of a harmonized assessment. The World Food Programme and the government were conducting a food security assessment, and to avoid duplication it was decided not to collect food security and livelihood information in a joint assessment taking place at the same time, but to focus on complementary sectors and integrate the results of the WFP assessment in the final report once both datasets were available. We are now at the end of this module. Please go on with the next one.